Trade what you see with Larry Pesavento. Call now, toll free at 1-877-927-6648 or internationally at 727-873-7618. Now, Larry Pesavento.
All right, looking good, Billy Ray. Feeling good, Lewis. And I believe we have Tim Bost on the line from Sarasota, Florida. Is that correct?
That's correct. Across the river from Sarasota, anyway. Near enough.
Very good, Tim. I thought you lived in Sarasota.
Well, actually, I'm in Palmetto, which is just across the river from in Manatee County there, so a couple of miles away. But have been in Sarasota area for about 30 years now. So.
Okay. By the way, I spoke to a friend of yours on Monday that spoke very highly of you, a guy named Alfie Lavoie up there in West Connecticut.
Good. Yeah.
He was telling you. Hey, he brought a question to me. Describe to the folks what horary astrology is, Tim. Do you have time to do that? I think
Surely.
We have two questions about that.
When we talk about astrology, what we're doing is looking at particular celestial alignments, the positions of the planets at specific moments in time. And traditionally what we do with astrology is look at the time of a person's birth or the birth of a company, the beginning of a trading of a stock. We're looking at an event that way and trying to interpret things on that basis. With horary astrology, we use the time of a chart to indicate a question. So if we've got a specific concern, a question that we really want to get an answer to, we can essentially set up a horoscope chart for the moment that the question is asked, and through a very, very specific set of skills, then we can discern what the likely outcome is in answering that question.
Wow. That's a little almost like reading tea leaves, isn't it, Bubba?
Yeah, it kind of borders on that a little bit, except that there are little stricter rules that need to be applied as opposed to reading tea leaves, which is just pretty intuitive. So.
Tim, what's the accuracy of something like that? Tim, actually, I've always shied away from that from my old Catholic background, having false gods and that kind of stuff. But what's the accuracy of horary stuff?
Well, it can be very, very accurate. Actually, I studied horary astrology with the late Olivia Barclay from the UK many years ago, and she always was very concerned about having the proper attitude. She was a student of William Lilly, who back in the 1600s wrote the first textbook of astrology in the English language, and the title of his book was Christian Astrology. And Olivia Barclay, like William Lilly, were both very, very concerned about having a very devout attitude and giving credit where credit is due to the divine. And so she said, now, when you're doing a horary chart, the question must be like a prayer. You want to be very sincere about your intentions. It's not something to be used trivially at all. And if your intentions are right and you are very serious about the interpretation, then you can get accurate answers.
Is this related at all to the Akashic records, do you think, or what is your feeling?
No, that's a separate kind of a concern there. The notion of the Akashic records is that all human events are perpetually recorded somewhere out in the ethers, and we can find past lives and things of that sort. With horary astrology, we're much more concerned about what's going on in the current time, and the notion is that if the trained astrologer gets the question at the appropriate time, then the answers are built into the timing of the question, so to speak.
Wow, this is really interesting, Tim. Tim, what do you see in the markets nowadays? I know you've been on the list for some of the best timers for Timers Digest. What are you seeing right now in the market?
Well, right now we're looking at a variety of factors. One of the things that we do is look on an ongoing basis at harmonic vibrations and their correlation with planetary cycles. And the things that seem to be dominating right now are second harmonic dynamics relative to the planet Mars. And through about the middle of June, we've got a sequence of events associated with Mars. And when we coordinate that with our cycle work, we're seeing some topping action in the broader market indices leading into a decline farther into the summer months.
Okay, well, is that Mars stuff? Is any related to the work that W.D. Gann did? Because I know he was very instrumental in bringing Mars to the astrology financial sections, way back in the 30s and 40s.
He was very fond of looking at Mars as a triggering factor. The thing that we want to understand with Mars cycles is that the planet Mars takes approximately 2 years to make a complete orbit around the sun, from our perspective. And so what we're looking at are essentially 2-year cycles, which gives us, if we've got a long trading history, we can do pretty good back testing with that, but it doesn't present us with trading opportunities every week. So when they come along, we want to pay attention to them on that basis. And we're looking at the second harmonic here, which is essentially the equivalent of the full moon, new moon dichotomy, the conjunctions and the oppositions of Mars to other planets. So this recent pullback that we saw, I believe, was triggered by the Mars-Jupiter opposition, which kicked in on the 5th of May. And so we saw some pretty good downdraft coming up with that. The next thing we're looking at is on the 27th of May, when Mars will be in opposition to the trans-Neptunian factor Hades, and we believe that will provide a very short-term trading bottom and then a move up for a few days anyway into early June, and then a further pullback from there. So we'll be discussing all of these factors. We're doing a webinar this weekend. We'll be doing one session of it on the weekend and then another repeat performance on Monday, and going into a little bit more depth with some of the techniques we use and looking at this forecast in much greater details.
Well, how would the folks access this webinar, Tim?
You can get the webinar. It's absolutely free by going to bit.ly/astro now, and that's lowercase ASTRO, capital N, capital O, capital W. bit.ly/ASTRO, capital N, capital O, capital W. We'll get you a link to the webinar, and you'll get your choice of the 2 times that we're doing it, so whatever works with your schedule best, we'd be glad to have you join us.
Well, that's really great. But giving good information out is always helpful because you help people, and when you help people, it comes back in the form of the green. So I want to wish you the best of luck.
The green and the smiles.
Yeah. Tim, we have a question. We have a question from one of our listeners about these longer-term cycles of 2 years. Do you ever apply any of these astroharmonics to a shorter time frame, like with day trading or anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. We did a book a few years back called Mercury, Money, and the Markets. The Mercury cycles are much more rapid, and we apply that to swing trading especially. As far as the intraday work, we look at the lunar cycles there primarily because the moon moves pretty rapidly relative to other astrological dynamics, and so we can fine-tune things on an intraday basis. So with our premier membership program here at Financial Cycles Weekly, we have our Gold Plus Elite membership program. We get with that group on a conference call once a week and talk about the specific intraday timing that we're looking at for the entire trading week ahead based on that intraday analysis using those lunar cycles.
Wow, that's very good. I really enjoy. We had Al Larson on last Friday or Thursday, and he had a lot to say. So, in fact,
he's got a lot about the lunar tides. He's an expert in that area. Really is.
Yeah, he certainly is. Hey, listen, why don't you stay with us and come back and tell us how we can get in touch with you? And we have one other question for you. If you could stay with us till after the break.
I'll stay right here.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Tim Bost, Financial Cycles Weekly out of Florida.
The Bull Bear Binary Option Hour. Next on TFNN.
Okay, Tim, we have a question from one of our listeners, and that is when you were 2 questions. This person, A, how did you get started doing this? And the second question is how long you've been doing it, and how much was W.D. Gann influential in your looking at astrology? Can you think you could break that down a bit?
Great questions. Wonderful.
Well, this is why they get the big bucks.
Yeah, okay. No, actually, I came to the application of astrology to the markets by studying astrology first. When I was doing my undergraduate work, I was an English major and studying the work of Geoffrey Chaucer and looking at some of the applications of astrology at that time in history, and kept reading astrological references not only in Chaucer but in William Shakespeare and many of the great writers over the centuries. So I got kind of curious about it and began to study it and was engaged in that for some years before it dawned on me that this also had application in the financial markets. I had been interested in the markets but had never actively traded. So as I began to work with all of that, then I soon learned about the work of W.D. Gann. His information about Gann was a little hard to come by and to track down, so a lot of my early years was seeking out information on Gann, and the more I encountered Gann's work and began to study his work, the more inspirational it was to me. I don't try to duplicate what Gann did, but he certainly was a big point of inspiration, and once you begin to understand how he was applying astrology to his analytical work, it's very, very exciting. And of course, Gann rarely talked about it directly. He did mention astrology here and there, but he was not promoting himself as a financial astrologer, just as a Wall Street prophet, I guess was the term he preferred.
Sure. Yeah.
It was very interesting in that regard. But I began all that work studying of astrology back in 1967, and so I've been at this for over half a century, and the application of the markets really date back to the mid-1980s when I began to study it, and have been publishing Financial Cycles weekly newsletter since 1987. So been at it and continuing to write and research in the area. It keeps me fascinated every day, gets me out of bed in the morning. So
no kidding.
It's a lot of fun.
This is really good information. In fact, you already answered one of the questions, which was when did you start being able to make a living on it? And I guess that was more than 30 years ago. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. I've been at this full time since the late 80s.
Okay, now we have one final question from one of our listeners up in Canada, and his question is, have you ever looked at the work of Evangeline Adams, the financial astrologer for J.P. Morgan?
Yeah, absolutely. Evangeline Adams was quite a remarkable woman, and she was doing her work in the 1890s primarily. She was associated with the famous Adams family of Boston, a great-grandniece, I believe, of John Adams, of the Founding Fathers fame, and got interested in studying astrology. She moved from Boston to New York City, and developed a reputation for herself very rapidly there. It was quite unusual for a single woman to set up any kind of business at that time, much less as an astrologer. But she achieved some notoriety with some accurate predictions. J.P. Morgan became one of her clients and, in fact, wanted to hire her full time. He had so much respect for her astrological work that he wanted to take her on a worldwide tour on his yacht and things of that sort. Kept trying to woo her, but she insisted that she needed to tend to other clients as well. So he had to show up at her office just like anybody else. She had her studio office above Carnegie Hall in New York City at that time, and had a very, very strong reputation. Very, very talented with her astrological skills, and certainly J.P. Morgan was not the only client that she had in the business community who relied on her insights for financial decisions. But Morgan famously said that millionaires don't use astrology, billionaires do. And Evangeline Adams was his astrologer, and Morgan was personally very proud of being the first billionaire, so he wanted to be in a very exclusive club. And so this was something that only the most wealthy people rely on for their financial success, was his implication.
You know, Tim, I was thinking of what you were talking about, and it sounded like something coming out of the page of the Knights Templar,
Uh,
or the proverbial secret book of Masonic law. But I didn't realize that Evangeline Adams was a descendant from the Boston Adamses. That's really amazing.
Yeah,
Folks,
absolutely.
tell the folks how they can reach you, Tim. Your best website or phone number, the best way some people can.
My email address is Tim at timbost.com, timbost.com. You can get connected with our free webinar at bit.ly/astronow. That's lowercase ASTRO, capital NOW. And then financialcyclesweekly.com is our flagship website for our newsletter and other services. We are now the global leader in astro trading education. This is what we focus on, training traders how to use these methodologies for their own benefit through the astro trading advantage.
Wow. Listen, thanks for joining us today. This was really interesting. Thanks to the folks up in Canada that asked those 3 great questions that led to a whole bunch of stuff. So
it was lots of fun.
Really,
appreciate the time with you again today, Larry.
Oh, yeah. We'll have you on again, and I hope your webinar, I'll be listening in, of course. I hope the other folks get a chance, too. So thank you very much for chiming in. It was really great.
Thanks again. You have a great day.
All right. You bet. Thank you, folks. That was Tim Bost of Palmetto, Florida, right outside of Sarasota, one of our favorite places to visit in the United States.